By summer 1846, the Mexican-American War was on. Both nations were rallying their armies and laying their plans to decide the fate of the American continent. The U.S. would move first, seizing the initiative to claim vast lands in the West and press the Mexicans in their homeland. In this video, we'll follow the events in the first months of the war as American forces rushed to make significant gains before Mexico could bring Santa Anna to bear. The declaration of war had an energizing effect in America. A spirit of national pride and conviction swept the country as newspapers loudly banged the war drum. For America, the Mexican attack in the Thornton Affair was an unforgivable insult, and it featured heavily in early war propaganda. As one poem said, "The Mexican hath pressed our soil, his hand hath shed the blood, o'er brave and gallant bosoms, and fiend-like he has stood, gloating with all murderers' joy as his poor victims lay, unburied on the desert shore, the loathsome vultures prey." Not everyone was so swept up in the war fever. President Polk's political opponents, particularly the Whigs, criticized the war as an aggressive act driven by the United States' desire to annex Mexican land. Their opposition was rooted in concerns about the morality of the conflict and fears that territorial expansion would bolster the institution of slavery. Despite their protests, the appetite for war was so intense that they could do little to sway public opinion as men eagerly marched off to fight. There were divisions within the American pro-war camp too, though. Polk's administration was split on the vision and conduct of the war. Secretary of State James Buchanan cautioned Polk about territorial ambition. He was concerned that Polk's desire to annex California or other territory would provoke the British or French to war. Polk refused to listen. He insisted that the U.S. would fight England or France too if need be, saying he would not, quote, permit or tolerate any intermeddling of any European power on this continent. Initially, Polk had plans to have Major General Winfield Scott lead the war effort. He was arguably America's most talented living general, having served with distinction in every conflict since the War of 1812. However, the two men despised each other, and word of Zachary Taylor's victories at Palo Alto and Resaca de Palma were enough for Polk to throw the command to Taylor instead, at least for now. The war would be waged on multiple fronts. The primary campaign under Zachary Taylor would focus on capturing northern Mexico, and in doing so, force the Mexican government to surrender after the loss of so much territory. A smaller force of about 1,000 men under Colonel Stephen Kearny would head into New Mexico and capture it before proceeding to California. The U.S. Pacific Squadron was already waiting to take California with the support of American rebels there. This would ensure territorial acquisitions in the West while keeping the bulk of the Mexican forces occupied in their homeland. Polk had good reason for optimism in California. Mexican-controlled California, known as Alta California, had a relatively low population of only a few thousand people. However, a recent influx of American settlers in the 1830s and 40s had shifted the region's demographics. Even without the war, it would have only taken a few more years for Americans to overtake the Mexicans there and inevitably drag it down the same path as Texas. America knew this. Specifically, the roguish explorer and Captain John Fremont, who defied his exploration orders to cross into Mexican territory at Sutter's Fort in December 1845 before war even began. In theory, he was there to search out new trade and travel routes, but with Mexican-American tensions already high, it was practically a recon mission for the imminent war. In March 1846, the Mexican authorities ordered him to leave. Around the same time, the Mexican governor, Jose Maria Castro, declared his intention to halt American settlement in California entirely, and he began encouraging native Indians to attack American settlers. On June 8th, these American settlers rose in rebellion. The Bear Flag Revolt numbered only a few hundred people, and even fewer of them were fighting men. Captain John Fremont actively supported and encouraged the Bear Flag Revolt, aligning his actions with American expansionist goals. Together with the rebels, his forces numbered barely 200 men. They were not alone, though. The U.S. Pacific Squadron under the command of Commodore John Sloat was stationed off the California coast, well aware of tensions between Mexico and the U.S. and awaiting word of hostilities. When Sloat heard about Fremont and the Bear Flag Revolt, he assumed that war must have broken out and word simply hadn't reached him. Not wanting to waste the opportunity, Sloat dropped anchor in the city of Monterrey to know Mexican resistance and declared the U.S. in control of the city. 2 days later, the U.S. Pacific Squadron seized San Francisco. Acting under orders to seize California if war broke out, Sloat declared California U.S. territory without his forces having fired a shot. Fremont and his men were thrilled to hear the news and rushed to Monterrey to link up with Sloat. However, when Sloat asked for details about the outbreak of war, Fremont was confused. Only then did Sloat realize that Fremont's actions had been entirely self-directed. Therefore, he had captured the entirety of California with no actual justification. Sloat was mortified and immediately left for Washington, trying to figure out how he'd explained what happened to his superiors and leaving California under the control of Fremont and his second-in-command, Captain Robert Stockton. Only after this did news of the actual outbreak of war reach California. Sloat, Fremont, and Stockton were exonerated. Immediately, Fremont and Stockton began planning a military response to Governor Castro, but the Mexican governor had no appetite for it. Castro appealed for peace, which Stockton rebuffed, but Castro simply dissolved his force and left anyway. With no enemies left, on August 17, 1846, Stockton officially declared victory in California. It would prove to be premature, but it was an auspicious start to the war. Victory would not be so easy elsewhere, though, and the leaders in Washington knew that. In order to carry out the war, the standing U.S. Army would not be enough. President Polk therefore got permission from Congress to raise an additional 50,000 volunteers. These citizen soldiers were separate from the professional soldiers. Many volunteers were motivated by a combination of national pride, personal ambition, and social pressure rather than professional or transactional reasons, though the communal bonds among units fostered a sense of camaraderie. The volunteers that went to fight in Mexico did so with a powerful sense of national identity and patriotic duty that, while familiar to us, was quite unique for its time. 29 volunteer regiments were raised in June and July of 1846 to be committed to the war effort. Most came from the American Midwest or the South, where enthusiasm for the Mexican-American War was highest, and most volunteered with friends or neighbors who brought close communal bonds into the service, which was further encouraged by the volunteers being grouped together by state: Arkansas men with Arkansas men, Mississippi men with Mississippi men, and so forth. While professional soldiers were usually drawn from the lower rungs of society with little prospect of steady employment elsewhere, the volunteer regiments were more diverse in background and social class. National duty, not the meager soldier's wage, seems to have been the biggest drive for recruitment. Also, unlike the regular army, volunteer regiments elected their officers. Sometimes this made for closer camaraderie and faith in their leaders, and at other times it came back to bite them, since the ability to win an election among peers had no bearing on someone's ability to command men effectively in battle. Given the looser organization and the popularity contests that attended leadership, discipline became a serious problem for volunteers. Officers were reluctant to punish their men for misdeeds or impose discipline, especially when officers came from the same communities as the men who had elected them in the first place. The lack of formal training only worsened inevitable problems of unleashing young, armed, unsupervised men onto a battlefront. Some American volunteers were infamous for being undisciplined and disobedient, and they gained a reputation for looting and other excesses over the course of the war. These incidences reflected the challenges of maintaining discipline among inexperienced troops. In contrast, the U.S. Army was generally known for its discipline and generally high standard of training and equipment. The greatest advantage the U.S. Army had was in its artillery. Not only were their guns more powerful and had a greater range than the Mexicans, but the U.S. relied upon fast-moving horses to move guns into position and out again before they could be targeted by the enemy. This flying artillery had won the day at Palo Alto and continued to give the U.S. a serious edge throughout the war. Meanwhile, the Mexicans had prepared their war effort too. Santa Anna had only reached Mexico City in late September 1846, too late to respond to the opening actions of the war. Santa Anna claimed he wanted to focus on the war, but also works to consolidate his political power. He briefly established a Council of State under his ally Gomez Farias before leaving the political factions to their infighting and heading to San Luis Potosi to assemble his forces for a confrontation with Taylor. On paper, Mexico's military situation was encouraging. The Mexican army outnumbered the U.S. 4-1, and the constant local rebellions meant that many of these troops had experience that their U.S. opponents lacked. However, this certainly wasn't true for every soldier, and the majority were forced conscripts from the poorer sections of society who had little commitment to service or choice in serving at all. Mexico faced additional challenges in supplies and leadership. Officer status was a coveted social and political role, but as a result, it created an oversupply of incompetent and uncommitted military leaders. Even more serious were the Army's supply issues. Some of the regiments did not even have enough weapons to arm every man, and Mexico had no active arms production facilities when war broke out. Funding was also a serious issue. Santa Anna tried to lean upon Congress and the church to cough up the money to support the war effort, but he would never fully solve his logistics or supply issues. In the end, Santa Anna had to mortgage his own estates in order to feed and equip his men. Two special quirks of the Mexican forces deserve some mention. First are the women, known as Soldaderes, who marched alongside the men. Soldaderes had emerged during the revolution as women who would travel with and sometimes fight alongside the men. Most Soldaderes never went into combat, but some would fight and die during several battles throughout the war, and they were potent symbols of Mexican nationalism. The Mexicans also received aid from another unexpected source: Irish Americans. A few hundred Irish Americans and some other European Catholics defected to the Mexicans during the war and participated in several battles as part of the famous St. Patrick's Battalion. Discrimination against the Irish in America and a sense of Catholic camaraderie were the primary reasons they threw in with Mexico, and they proved quite effective on the battlefield, but were seen as traitors by the Americans. As Santa Anna was still getting things in order, it was America that made the first serious moves. Following the victory at Resaca de Palma, Taylor had moved to Fort Texas, and the Mexicans had retreated back across the Rio Grande. In July, Taylor's forces crossed the river after them, becoming the first U.S. Army to invade foreign soil since the invasion of Spanish Florida in 1818. Polk and his administration had little clear direction for Taylor, who found their orders vague and frustrating. He was, quote, to dispose the enemy to desire an end to the war in the shortest space of time practical, as the Secretary of War William Marcy wrote to him. Taylor found communication with Washington to be so frustrating that he avoided it whenever he could, a choice that would soon come back to haunt him. Meanwhile, Mexican forces under General Pedro de Ampudia fortified themselves at the fortress town of Rio Monterrey, not to be confused with the Californian Monterrey. Santa Anna had warned against such a move. He did not believe the defenses were adequate to hold against the Americans, but with few other options, Santa Anna's argument lost out. The Mexican fortifications around Monterrey were formidable, but they had a critical weakness. Ampudia had relied upon natural fortifications as the basis for his defense, which meant their locations were not optimal. Most fortified locations were strong in isolation, but were too far apart to effectively help each other if they got in trouble. By concentrating on individual fortified positions one by one, Taylor could methodically pick his enemy apart. He began with an assault on Federacion Hill southwest of the town, which gave them a good overview position on other defenses. With that position, General Worth was able to capture nearby Fort Soldado, effectively giving Americans total control of the western approach to Monterrey. Similar assaults were ordered on the eastern fortifications. On September 21st, Taylor's forces mounted assault on two separate fortifications at El Teneria and El Diablo. The assault on El Teneria, however, was a mistake. Taylor had only wanted his men to launch a diversionary attack to occupy Mexican attention for the real attack on El Diablo. Unfortunately, vague instructions and overzealous troops resulted in the feint becoming a full-on attack, and Taylor was forced to commit extra men to avoid a total disaster. The Americans suffered heavy casualties in both regulars and volunteers, with the 1st Volunteer Regiment sent into battle breaking down and retreating. The Americans successfully took the position, but with 400 casualties, it was their costliest day of the war so far. The next day, Worth and Taylor finished the total encirclement of Monterrey as Ampudia withdrew the rest of his forces inside the city. On September 23rd, Taylor came in from the east as Worth swept in from the west, taking Monterrey street by street in brutal urban fighting. Casualties were high, as the U.S. called in its artillery advantage to obliterate buildings and the Mexican defenders inside them. It was slow going, but by dawn of the 24th, it was clear that the Americans would soon take the city. Desperate, Ampudia sent word to Taylor begging for peace. Although skeptical, Taylor ultimately agreed. In exchange for the peaceful surrender of the city, Ampudia and his men would be free to leave. Ampudia implied that peace negotiations were underway, which Taylor, isolated from Washington, mistakenly believed. Taylor was in such infrequent communication with Washington that he didn't know any better. The siege had also been hard on Taylor's men. They had suffered their heaviest casualties of the war so far, and the combination of sleepless nights, hot weather, and strained food supplies had sapped morale. It made sense for Taylor, accepting an 8-week armistice until things could be cleared up. When word reached Washington of the armistice some days later, they were not pleased. On principle, they were outraged that Taylor had accepted an armistice at all. As far as they were concerned, Taylor had a huge chunk of the Mexican army in his grasp and should have pressed the attack anyway. Another few days of fighting could have delivered the Mexicans into U.S. hands as defeated enemies, whose weapons they could seize before releasing them. They did not believe that Taylor's morale issues and casualties were nearly bad enough to justify holding back. Taylor was forced to end the armistice early. He informed Ampudia's men that they would be spared, but they had to leave the city immediately and leave their weapons behind. The Mexican forces withdrew on September 30th, beginning a weeks-long trek to join Santa Anna at San Luis Potosí. Food was scarce, and many men died during the march. Meanwhile, Taylor's army occupied Monterrey, where reports of looting, violence, and mistreatment of civilians emerged. Although Taylor acknowledged these incidents, few measures were taken to impose discipline, exacerbating tensions with the local population. Several dozens of civilians were killed and many more abused by the occupying army. The capture of Monterrey marked a successful milestone for the Americans, but the war was only just beginning. Santa Anna was amassing his forces to strike back against Taylor's outnumbered army. The campaigns in California and New Mexico were intensifying, and Washington was already drawing up plans for a naval invasion from the Gulf Coast. The war was only going to get worse. If you'd like to help us keep creating and get early access to our videos, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks, consider becoming a member right here on YouTube or joining us on Patreon. Every bit of support helps. And as always, thank you so much for watching.